In July 1975, Pink Floyd brought their Dark Side of the Moon tour to a close with a performance at Knebworth Festival. They performed all of the Dark Side of the Moon, most of the yet-to-be-released Wish You Were Here, Echoes, and 2 songs destined for what would be Animals. The critically lauded performance included all of the audiovisual cues that had become associated with Pink Floyd. From the mesmerizing light show to a model plane exploding into the stage set, not forgetting the huge mirror ball suspended behind the band, throwing shards of light across the site. For many Pink Floyd fans, it represented a high point in their personal experience of the band's career. It was exactly what the music press had told them to expect. It met audience demands. The band played the Dark Side of the Moon in its entirety. What more could you ask for? For a 13-year-old boy from the leafy Buckinghamshire market town of Marlow-on-Thames, that answer came some 7 months later, when the Sex Pistols performed at High Wycombe's Buckingham College of Higher Education on Friday, 20th February 1976. That performance presented 15 minutes of visceral, adrenalized rock complete with audience attacking the singer. A student union DJ desperately trying to get the band off stage by putting disco records on between songs, plugs being pulled, microphones being destroyed, and fights between roadies, audience, and the band's entourage. In those 15 minutes, I was introduced to a generation gap that separated me from my older brother and his friends. In only 15 minutes, my life had become less about us and them, and more us versus them, as I fully embraced the notion of the binary oppositional divide that had driven rock and roll since its emergence some 20 years earlier. My binary divide was obvious. My 18-year-old brother's generation, as represented by that Pink Floyd gig, were old and dull. This new young thing was exciting, only it was not to be that simple. In mid-1975, around the same time as that Pink Floyd gig, a young John Lydon, aka Rotten, was invited to join the Sex Pistols, more as a result of his style than his singing ability. That style included harshly chopped and dyed green hair and a green Pink Floyd t-shirt with the words, "I hate," written above the band's name. Indeed, in that act, a binary opposition between what was to become known as punk and the dinosaur rock, acts as epitomized by Pink Floyd, was presented and codified through the nihilism of hatred. Pink Floyd was singled out as representative of all that Lydon et al. Were supposed to despise. With the Dark Side of the Moon remaining at the top of the album charts for what seemed like an age, Pink Floyd became the target of them in the sights of us. It was a simple binary that would become presented through the battlegrounds of audience distance, musical skill, and class, as expressed via the tropes of authenticity. This chapter explores the shifting notions of authenticity and authentication through the presumed oppositional binary of punk and progressive rock, with specific reference to Pink Floyd, in contrast to John Lydon's activities as a member of the Sex Pistols and then Public Image Ltd., PIL. It will argue that both Pink Floyd and Lydon emerged with an oppositional aesthetic and ideology that was represented through the duality of absence and presence that can be seen as simultaneously punk and progressive rock gestures. These gestures underpinned the authenticating urge associated with Pink Floyd and Lydon, Sex Pistols, PL. Yet the authentication of both Floyd and Lydon reveals interestingly inverted journeys, with Lydon moving from the presence of punk to the absence of progressive, through his journey from Sex Pistols to PIL, while Floyd's journey from the absence of their psychedelic era to presence of Animals, 1977, offers an inversion of this model that underlined the punk nature of their progressive tendencies. Both journeys can be observed through the context of the radius of creativity, with both absence and presence becoming interchangeable authenticating elements of both Floyd and Lydon's progressive punk progressive tendencies. Whether Oasis versus Blur or Dole-Q versus Art School, the simplistic binary has been employed throughout the history of rock music as a marker of authenticity. Much of punk's ire was aimed at what were defined as dinosaur bands that seemed to have limited relevance to the lives of young people in the late 1970s. Johnny Rotten's "I Hate Pink Floyd" t-shirt became a representation of all bands that sat at the dinosaur end of the rock spectrum, while Pink Floyd epitomized all that Rotten et al. Considered authentically redundant. Their albums, Artwork and live shows were indulgent. Their fans seemed passive, and their market was mainstream. Indeed, by 1976, The Dark Side of the Moon, although only peaking at number 2 in the UK charts, had been in the sales charts continually since its release on March 31, 1973. The punk argument was simple. Pink Floyd and the progressive rock they represented was irrelevant, old and absent. Punk was new, authentic, and very present. If the newly active punk generation were hitting out at all old bands defined as dinosaurs, why then has the myth emerged that the binary opposition was between punk and prog? Quite simply, of all of the dinosaurs, it was the progressive rock bands that appeared to be most removed from punk's motivational ideologies. Borthwick and Moy, 2004, state that progressive rock was a product of the late 1960s zeitgeist, wherein virtuosity, complexity, and the album as art form assumed greater significance within the newly named rock field. Floyd and their ilk were presented as an irrelevance in the face of punk rock's own late 1970s zeitgeist of the urgency of the Seven single. The opposition between punk and progressive rock was first mediated through a Melody Maker review of the 100 Club Punk Festival in October 1976. Journalist Caroline Kuhn drew on the words of an audience member to make the point. "They're great," shouted a bespectacled youth halfway through the Clash's set. "I used to listen to Yes and Genesis," thus locating a rejection of progressive rock as a defining aspect of punk identity, and inscribing this duality into youth culture history. Progressive rock was from this point mediated as the main dinosaur genre, with little relationship to that period's punk zeitgeist. The mediation of punk's limited music ability came in contrast to progressive rock's associations with high levels of musicianship achieved through the privileged processes of the traditional music education system. Inevitably, the emphasis on academic achievement pointed to class-based links to music genres. Where progressive rock's highly qualified, highly skilled, immersive album listening experience and visually indulgent performance became mediated through the cultural capital of the middle classes, punk's low-skill, autodidactic, 7-inch single focus and communal subcultural thrust was mediated as authentically working class. Both positions were intrinsically problematic. This focus within the ideological rock press mirrored the concerns of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Studies, whose subcultural theories presented, in Paul Hodkinson's 2002 terms, an overly simplistic opposition between opposition culture and dominant culture, which was located in the notion that there existed singular, subversive meanings of subcultural styles, which ultimately reflected class position of participants. The result of this position was that the study of popular music became preoccupied with the working class experience as an expression of subcultural authenticity. Subcultural theorist Dick Hebdige, 1979, places class at the core of his hypothesis, viewing all subcultural activity as strategy among working-class youth to position themselves in relation to a parent culture that has become increasingly irrelevant, and to define a sense of self that does make sense in relation to like-minded individual. This position effectively defined popular music as a space through which class is articulated. Given the fact that the study of popular music grew out of both an analysis of textual works and youth subcultures, there was almost an inevitability that critics who were informed by and informed these studies would show similar analytical focus on the authenticity of class-based subcultural experience. Class thus became employed as a marker of authenticity, with emphasis being placed on the working class experience. Conversely, the critical authentication of music within the rock press also placed a huge emphasis on the values of musicianship, poetics, and aspects of creativity that implied educational aspirations of the middle classes. Roy Schuker, 2012, has noted that discussions around authenticity have played a central role within rock music discourse. He argues that the authentic artist presents a number of key attributes such as creativity, originality, and sincerity, each an area of Floyd's oeuvre that punk claimed was redundant. Simon Frith proposes a typology of authenticities. First, the time-served argument that presupposes the authenticity of a band that has paid their dues over a period of time of working on their craft. The second expression of authenticity emerging through the ascribed notion that rock music is an art form that can be seen as a subcultural expression of difference and originality. And third, that a rock community exists, through which all subcultural actors, regardless of whether they are audience or artist, share a common bond. While it would be wrong to suggest that any of punk's main players held anywhere near the time-served authenticity outlined in Frith's model, it is also debatable whether Pink Floyd and the artists most readily associated with them in the period leading up to punk were part of a clearly defined subcultural style or a shared common bond. Indeed, Pink Floyd's claim to oppositional culture came through its association with London's countercultural and psychedelic scenes in the decade before punk. Alan Moore, 2002, proposes a tripartite typology of first, second, and third-person authenticity that explores the meaning of authentication through an emphasis on who, rather than what, is being authenticated. Such an approach places subsequent attention on the ascription of authenticity and allows for the tensions at work in this process. He proposes that first-person authenticity, or authenticity of expression, arises when an originator succeeds in conveying the impression that his/her utterance is one of integrity, that it represents an attempt to communicate in an unmediated form with an audience. These can be viewed through extra-musical actions, which directly convey a sense of emotion, and is where the performer is recognized as being authentic to themselves. Third-person authenticity, he argues, is where a performer is identified as authentically representative of a third party or other group. While Moore's 2002 concept of second-person authenticity, or the authenticity of experience, hinges on the experience of authenticity and occurs when a performance succeeds in conveying the impression to a listener that that listener's experience of life is being validated, that the music is telling it like it is for them. Authenticity is not inscribed in either art or artist, but is something ascribed in the process of interpreting the performance. It is in the actual attribution of authenticity as confirmation of creative merit that we can view the impact of the mediation of art, artist, genre, and the historical perspective surrounding the event. Moore's 2002 model for authentication allows for authenticity to be ascribed, subsequently highlighting the role of the media in this process. As noted, the rock press prioritized the subcultural authenticity of music that would move people to work against the perceived parent culture and to attempt to effect social change. However, this subcultural authenticity was also linked to musical and poetic ability, which, as has been noted, created a dichotomy around the mediation of both punk as lowbrow, unskilled, subcultural oppositional agitator, and progressive rock as the highbrow, highly skilled, aspirational marker of taste. As a subculture, punk clearly defined itself against a perceived mainstream parent culture, drawing comparisons to working-class identified subcultures that had preceded it. The rock press authentication of punk was simply a continuation of long-held ideologies of what constituted authentic underground garage rock. Many rock critics were subsequently often highly antagonistic towards progressive rock due to its apparent embrace of establishment through the heavy influence of classical music. Indeed, rock critic Lester Bangs considered progressive rock the insidious befoulment of all that was gutter pure in rock. Perhaps unsurprisingly, punk was the focus of much early subcultural analysis and became epitomized as a representation of Britain's post-war working-class youth subcultures that challenged dominant ideology, hegemony, and social normalization through symbolic forms of resistance. Punk was thus easily written into being within the pages of the rock press as a stylistic expression of opposition to a parent culture, while its music was proposed as being representative of that very present opposition. If the progressive rock acts had become personified by absence, then their engagement through recordings had become defined by a dislocation from the communal act of dancing. Punk, like its rock and roll predecessor, was animated via the 7-inch single. It was a format that drove the communal nature of subcultural engagement by encouraging public sharing. Following 1967's concept album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles turned their backs on live performance to concentrate on recording. Rock music subsequently increasingly prioritized private listening over the public hearing experience. Listening is a process through which we develop frameworks for interpreting and understanding sound. It is, as Tara Brabazon, 2012, remarks, intentional, conscious, and active. While we may hear noise, we listen to music. By implication, serious rock artists, and especially those within the progressive rock genre, with its associations with classical music forms that demanded close listening, were deemed legitimate culture, in Bourdieu's terms, and worthy of being listened to. The immersive and solitary listening experience demanded by full-length conceptual albums, with supporting album artworks, introduced the notion of serious rock music, with a perceived greater value and associated with a legitimized notion of taste. It was an approach that became epitomized by progressive rock, where bands like Yes, Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, Genesis, and Pink Floyd delivered concept albums housed in highly creative sleeves, with tracks that in some cases lasted the full length of one side of a vinyl disc. The individual listener was under no illusion that every aspect of the progressive rock experience was valuable and serious. The rest was deemed frivolous noise by a music press that modeled itself on the romantic authenticities of the rock era. Singles-driven pop music was thus reduced to the level of disposability. Bourdieu, 1984, viewed taste as a means of naturalizing class differentiation, and thus demonstrating and justifying class distinction. In this understanding, taste is an affirmation of economic power. Working-class tastes serve as a negative reference point, anchored in well-established aesthetics associated with needs, and then deprived of cultural capital, to expand a frame of reference defined by the taste of necessity. The middle-class taste culture associated with economic freedom defines and asserts itself against the working-class taste of necessity, and thus holds an implicit legitimacy and superiority. Music that demanded solitary, serious, appreciative, educated listening gained priority over hearing music as a shared communal necessity. Serious rock music was thus deemed superior to pop. Progressive rock, a music of aesthetic distinction, was superior to punk's valueless and tasteless working-class noise. Progressive rock's absence was presented as having higher cultural value than punk rock's presence, despite punk's clearer call to a subcultural authenticity. Progressive and punk operated within this binary. In the first Sex Pistols interview, Johnny Rotten declared, "I hate shit. I hate hippies and what they stand for. I hate long hair. I hate pub bands. I want to change it so there are rock bands like us." This can be taken as UK punk's earliest public statement of intent. Interestingly, the term punk was neither used adjectively nor collectively in the feature. Rotten himself identifies Sex Pistols as rock, or as a continuum of a form of rock music, perceived as lost or absent from the present. If Rotten's statement of intent was a blueprint for the dissemination of punk, it was clear that the key actors were as yet not using the term to define themselves. Indeed, UK punk is only fully defined in the mainstream press as both genre and subculture, as late as August 1976, via Caroline Coon's Melody Maker piece, Punk Rock Rebels Against the System. This piece was published in a month that was flanked by the Sex Pistols' last two residency dates at the 100 Club, and presented the clearest outline of UK punk as a self-identifying heroic subculture. It was also published a matter of weeks after the first edition of Sniffin' Glue fanzine, 1976-1977, which summed up the confusion over definitions of punk rock through its subtitle, Plus Other Rock and Roll Habits for Punks, and varied content that included Blue Oyster Cult, along with the Ramones. Punk's clearest opposition to rock music's so-called dinosaurs took place through the authenticating element of presence. British rock music had seemingly become distanced from its roots. By 1975-76, the years that birthed UK punk, a number of UK's rock artists, such as David Bowie, Genesis, and two of the former members of the Beatles, had moved beyond the gaze of the UK audience and relocated abroad. Artists such as The Who, Led Zeppelin, Queen, and Pink Floyd, who had once been the mainstays of the student unions and small club and pub circuits, were now too popular to even regularly play the larger London venues like the Hammersmith Odeon or the Rainbow, and opted instead to book huge arenas such as Earl's Court and Wembley Empire Pool. To counteract issues of distance between audience and performer, many bands started to deliver ever more grandiose performances, with excessive light and film shows. This was especially evident among the progressive acts, whose lack of movement and self-absorbed non-performance became hidden by excessive lighting effects, and, in the case of Peter Gabriel of Genesis, an array of costume changes. By 1975, with the lack of a viable selection of new rock acts that could attract large audiences, student unions largely opted to become discotheques. These 7-inch record-driven events would also feature small-scale live acts, including old mainstays that had never been able to translate the hard work of constant gigging to significant market share of record sales and audience popularity. Student union entertainment secretaries would also book newer bands that had been championed by the rock press, such as the mid-1970s pub rock scene that had similarly been unable to convert column inches to sales and popularity. It was into the discotheque environment of the student union bars that the proto-punk Sex Pistols first went into battle. The huge stadium gigs of the stars of progressive rock were too distant to offer any tangible sense of subcultural opposition. Rather, they became emblematic of the separation and distance of a ruling elite. Pink Floyd acknowledged the distance between themselves and the industry that they belonged to, the space between their past and present histories, and the void between presence and absence on the album Wish You Were Here, 1975, which coincided with the emergence of proto-punk. In his analysis of the album, Edward Macken argues that Wish You Were Here was a conceptual piece supporting an overall theme of absence. Indeed, Macken suggests that Pink Floyd's mid to late 1970s music was imbued with a range of absences, not only from audience, industry, and community, but also from the dominant progressive rock form. In the period of the proto-punk reaction to punk's codification, 1975-1977, Pink Floyd's music, although involving lengthy instrumental sections, was notable for its apparent simplicity, despite being harmonically complex. Songs were dominated by David Gilmour's extended blues-based guitar solos and Richard Wright's light jazz chord structures and ambient synth passages. Indeed, Wright's musique-concrete experiments, such as rubbing the rims of glasses to achieve a ringing bell sound, as heard on Wish You Were Here, or the barrage of ringing clocks on Time from the Dark Side of the Moon, did little to challenge the listener, instead simply supporting mood and conceptual context. Rhythmically, too, Nick Mason's stripped-down drums rarely strayed from a 4/4, despite the obvious exceptions like Money from the Dark Side of the Moon, which is in 7/8 in all sections but the guitar solo, where it shifts to 4/4. Punk's emergence, on the other hand, had been informed by a visceral presence. It was a form that was delivered via the visual violence of bricolage and the intensely claustrophobic physical closeness of audience and artist. It was defined through supposed lyrical realism, and in contrast to the growth of serious listening, punk's emergence had occurred around the ideology of an apparent anyone-can-do-it musical simplicity. Fanzine editor Tony Moon's renowned illustration, "Here's a chord, here's another, here's a third. Now form a band," came to embody an emphasis on a supposed egalitarian, low-skill threshold. Punk's performed definition came in the shape of a celebration of unskilled players, which extended to the subcultural rejection of the skills associated with education. Sight reading and graded exams, for instance, were replaced by the ability to feel the music and perform accordingly, thus stretching back to the aesthetics of many of the 1960s British skiffle and R&R scenes, whose class position limited access to formal music education. However, in reality, many of the first wave of punk musicians were in fact highly skilled, with experience of playing in bands long before the codification of a punk subculture. This would enable the punk genre to extend its musical reach within 18 months of the Sex Pistols' first gig. There is an acceptance that creativity leads to progressive tendencies. As Sheila Whiteley notes, the authenticity of progressive rock was constituted by specific musical features, which show a sense of development and originality from bass style. When Johnny Rotten left the Sex Pistols to form Public Image Limited, it was commonly presented in the rock press as the singer reaching beyond the increasingly standardized confines of punk's codification, now embracing a more creative approach to music making. Now known as Johnny Lydon, He could be seen to reach back to his own roots in the progressive forms of krautrock, space rock, psychedelia, and dub. The results can be viewed as heralding the emergence of the retrospectively named post-punk movement, an uprising of creativity that Simon Reynolds suggests came to complete punk's unfinished promise. This simplistic linear perspective negates the fact that many of UK punk's first guard of music creatives can be seen to have drawn heavy influence from psych pop, art pop, jazz rock, space rock, and krautrock. For example, the influence of Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart is a constant among early punks, with the first incarnation of the Buzzcocks covering Don Van Vliet's I Love You, You Big Dummy. Later covered by Magazine, the Pink Floyd Indebted Band, formed by Howard Devoto after departing the Buzzcocks. Furthermore, the Keith Levine-penned What's My Name, from the eponymous debut album by The Clash, is built through chord and harmonic structures and tonal ambiguity that echoed Captain Beefheart's work. Alternative TV covered Frank Zappa's Why Don't You Do Me Right on their debut album The Image Has Cracked, 1978, which, as Paul Hegarty and Martin Halliwell note, opens with a 9-minute Moog-assisted progressive rock overture. Doubtless inspired by working, living, and touring with progressive space rock band Here and Now, with whom Alternative TV released a shared one-side-each live album, What You See Is What You Are. Their second album, Vibing Up the Senile Man Part 1, 1979, released only 10 months after their debut, found the band applying a punk aesthetic to the avant-garde jazz of Art Ensemble of Chicago and Sun Ra, as well as the ever-present influences of Captain Beefheart, Frank Zappa, and the tonal drones. Similarly, the presence of British psychedelic bands hung like a specter over Wire, whose own development would reveal echoes of Pink Floyd's progression. Having signed to and reignited Harvest Records, Wire moved from the early Brian Eno style, 2-minute art pop punk blasts of Pink Flag, 1977, to the Barrett-era Floyd psych pop whimsy of Chairs Missing, 1978, and onto the long-form structured progressive tendencies of 154, 1979, all in a period of just under 2 years. Post-punk's emergence can be argued to have occurred symbiotically with punk's codification. In considering punk rock's sampling of a range of musical forms from the past, it is useful to consider Toynbee's 2000 deployment of Pierre Bourdieu's 1984 concepts of habitus, strategy, and field through the radius of creativity model. Toynbee argues that popular musicians are active creative agents operating in modes of expression that are heavily prescribed. The habitus predisposes a musician to a set of approaches to playing, writing, and performing that draw from broader stylistic strategies. These strategies are deployed on a field, a prescribed and competitive cultural space of popular music institutions, genres, and practices. Toynbee 2000 augments Bourdieu by saying it is the space of possibles that are key to understanding musical creativity. Possibles arise in the relationship between the habitus, the field of musical practice, and the likelihood of selection, of stylistic practices, musical works, instruments, and technical practices and strategies from this field. This forms the basis of the radius of creativity, a figurative space demonstrating the range of the likely creative possibles of an individual agent. Among these possibles is the appropriation of earlier voices, which is often unintentional and entirely subconscious. The clearest example of Pink Floyd's direct relationship with punk came through the Damned's entirely conscious intention to inject their second album, Music for Pleasure, 1977, with the creative drive of psychedelic rock. Coming only 10 months after their debut and UK punk rock's first album, Damned, 1977, production duties for Music for Pleasure were taken up by Pink Floyd's Nick Mason. However, Mason hadn't been the Damned's first choice. They had wanted Syd Barrett, but he was unavailable due to his mental health-induced reclusive lifestyle. The choice of Barrett was through a shared love of his psych pop songs for Pink Floyd and on his own solo releases. Despite the inclusion of avant-garde jazz saxophonist Lol Coxhill, the album could not be regarded as a successful stretch towards a psychedelic imprint. Mason states, "Unfortunately, they were having a nasty dose of musical differences at the time. The suggestion of a particular bass line using a glissando slide was rejected out of hand, and the idea of more than a couple of takes was seen as heresy. We finished the album and mixed it in the time Pink Floyd would have taken to set up the microphones. Of Mason's production, sounds critic Peter Silverton, 1977, suggested the drummer seems to have worked on the basis of letting the damned have it their own way. There's no tricks, just a constant barrage of primal simplicity. Pity he can't do the same for the Floyd. Ironically, early Pink Floyd in their 1966-1967 punk moment could actually have been described as a constant barrage of primal simplicity. In many ways, however, Pink Floyd's own emergence can be seen as both the punk and post-punk of pre-progressive rock. They can be viewed as the enfants terribles of progressive rock due to their lack of virtuosity and structural simplicity, while McCann's 1997 analysis depicts them as being closely aligned with art rock's progeny. Dickinson, 2014, argues that Pink Floyd's punk moment came in a brief period between 1966 and 1967 when they employed punk's tactics of negation and shock to challenge the hegemonic spectacle of mid-60s British pop. Indeed, Nick Mason had described the Damned's debut album as a punk rock insurrection, which was a welcome return to where Pink Floyd originated. Between February and June of 1966, Pink Floyd performed at a series of improv happenings, advertised as the Spontaneous Underground, at venues such as London Institute for Contemporary Arts and the Wardour Streets Marquee Club. The experience of these events would have a profound influence on the band as they began to introduce extended improvised passages into their sets. It was an act that directly challenged contemporary rock notions of technical skill and virtuosity that were based on mastery of classic jazz and blues approaches. None of the band could claim to possess virtuosic skill. Shifting between radio-friendly psychedelic pop and abrasive improvisation, the band's live show was a representation of the band's creative dichotomy. On the one hand, their psychedelic pop numbers were attracting interest from music industry executives and audiences in full expectation of a set of similar ditties. Following the release of their first single, Arnold Lane, on March 10, 1967, on the EMI label, audiences came to their gigs with a full expectation of hearing psych pop. Conversely, the band's desire was to push the boundaries of expectation through often aggressive improvisation. It was an act that extended beyond song structure into extensive use of high volume, disorienting sound effects, and discombobulating stage lighting. The effect was a negation of hegemonic pop performance, an assault on the senses that had little to do with the jazz and folk-influenced psychedelia of contemporary acts such as Soft Machine. As Sean Albia's 2006-2012 has noted, Pink Floyd's late 60s Reaction in G was a single-chord drone played at heckling audiences in an early defiant punk-like gesture. The band's shift from the happenings of London's fashionable psychedelic underground cognoscenti to the grueling environment of the national tours they embarked on, following their signing to EMI, revealed the conflict between audience expectation and the band's creative urge. Dickinson notes that, as the label's next projected sound of 67, a vigorous attempt was made to frame them as part of a marketable stable of pop acts, with photo ops and fan magazine interviews, singles and LP, and a grueling schedule of national and international gigs and radio station sessions, along with appearances on the flagship BBC pop show, Top of the Pops. The Floyd played over 200 shows in 1967, visiting the north of England and Scotland, sometimes playing 2 shows in one night. Many audiences found the band's extended passages of aggressive, simplified improvisation hard to comprehend. The band's co-manager, Peter Jenner, suggests that they were limited to either playing the blues clubs or the professional pop circuit, where neither audience was particularly impressed. Nick Mason, 2004, states, "They hated us. The audience would come expecting a band who would have a repertoire that had some link to Top of the Pops. Of course, what they got was the full psychedelia, and they generally hated it. Hostile crowds reacted with either deliberate slow hand claps, a cowed silence, or throwing beers and coins at the band, in a response somewhat akin to punk audiences. On April 24, 1967, At the Feathers pub on Ealing, Broadway, someone threw a coin that hit Roger Waters in the forehead and drew blood. The band seemed to find some solace in these reactions, with a combative Roger Waters describing Pink Floyd's sounds as cooperative anarchy in their first press interview. He was reported to have said, "At least we frightened a few people tonight," after a particularly aggressive performance in Bedford. 9 years later, these same reactions would be meted out to the Sex Pistols at their early provincial shows. As with early Floyd, the Sex Pistols were faced with a choice of two types of venue: the blues and jazz pub venues or the student union discotheques. Many of the Sex Pistols' earliest gigs in London and in London's satellite towns were at art school union bars, or at least colleges with an art school presence. While the general response was one of audience apathy or choreographed outrage, I have noted already the first time that unplanned, spontaneous chaos manifested as audience violence was at a gig in High Wycombe's Buckingham College of Higher Education on Friday, February 20th, 1976, when the Sex Pistols were supporting Screaming Lord Sutch as part of the end of a Rag Week celebratory discotheque. Richard Boone, who would become manager of the Buzzcocks, who formed as a result of this gig, recalls, "Half a dozen longhairs from the back of the hall moved to the front and sat under the stage making sardonic and sarcastic gestures to their mates at the back. Johnny leant forward and tousled their hair. Their back-of-hall mates ran to the front, pulled John off stage and started a ruck while the band kept playing. Neil Stevenson, band tour manager, and bits of the Pistols crew joined in. A Tom and Jerry cartoon-esque melee ensued as the band kept playing, until Johnny scampered out, back on stage, and remarked, 'That was no fun.' And of course the Stooges' No Fun was what they were playing. We were like, what the fuck? Until this point, attempts at creating this reaction had been orchestrated by band manager Malcolm McLaren, clothes designer Vivian Westwood, and McLaren and Westwood's Seditionaries shop sales assistant Jordan, and met with general derision or disinterest. Or, as John Savage, 1991, recounts, 50% indifference, 25% hostility, 20% hilarity, and 5% immediate empathy. These reactions had revolved around the questionable interplay between Rotten's petulant vandalism and Jordan's shock antics, whether throwing chairs or willfully destroying equipment as witnessed at their debut show with Bazooka Joe. The Sex Pistols' appearance at Andrew Logan's 1976 Valentine's party saw Rotten rip Jordan's top off in an abusive display of rock misogyny. More Woodstock with swastikas than Cash from Chaos. Far from being oppositional forces, the early performances of both Pink Floyd and the Sex Pistols held similar concerns based on a desire to challenge through extreme performance spectacle. The two acts similarly faced the challenge of marrying the needs of commerce with personal aims for creative autonomy. Pink Floyd would eventually explore this theme in Have a Cigar and Welcome to the Machine from Wish You Were Here, 1975. While the Sex Pistols would pen their challenge to industry control on the song EMI, 1977, before Lydon's subsequent use of his PIL project as an attempted subversion of the industry's commercial activities. Where Stacey Thompson argues that the entire field of punk can be understood as a set of problems that unfold from a single contradiction between aesthetics and economics, between punk, understood as a set of cultural productions and practices that comprise an aesthetic field, and capitalism and the commodity, an economic field and an economic form in which punks discover that they must operate. He might also have been discussing the dichotomous contradictory relationship between aesthetics and economics that challenged Pink Floyd during their 1966-1967 punk moment. A surprising similarity between these two bands is notable in the fact that both Pink Floyd and the Sex Pistols were criticized for a lack of virtuosity in comparison to their peers. By drawing on Rob Wallace, one may argue that punk subverted rock music's disdain for perceived musical charlatanism by making the lack of virtuosity a virtue, a marker of authenticity. But the same marker of authenticity was employed by Floyd in their psychedelic period, where their musicianship was secondary to the sound, volume, and light moods they sculpted. Indeed, despite the often impenetrably aggressive improvisations creating distance between them and their audience, the visceral performance was acutely present, holding many of the sonic concerns of the punks who would follow. Nick Mason had himself described the band's early gigs as a sort of punk thing. Very free. It's funny when you're improvising and you're not particularly technically able. It's one thing if you're Charlie Parker. It's another thing if you're us. The ratio of good stuff to bad is not that great. Clearly, psychedelia's cooperative anarchy was a huge influence on punk. However, Pink Floyd's punk moment can ultimately be presented as present distance leading to distant absence, as they moved away from the abrasion of their earliest performances and instead drew on a range of musical foils as an embrace of the importance of high-skilled musicianship and complex compositional structure. Floyd's early techniques of hiding behind walls of noise and projected visuals enabled them to have a distance from the live performance and became a metaphor for Syd Barrett's gradual retreat into absence. It is perhaps little surprise that when Johnny Lydon formed his post-Sex Pistols band Public Image LID, his first act in defiance of punk's increased pop standardization was the deployment of techniques of absence. The Reversed PIL were presented not as a band but as a company, subsequently addressing the dichotomous relationship between aesthetics and commerce of both punk rock and early Floyd. Second, some of the early shows by PIL were performances of abrasive, free-form, cooperative anarchy, played behind a screen that separated band from audience. Absence was thus used as an authenticating aspect of PIL's punk aesthetic over the standardization of present punk. As with Floyd's early psychedelic shows, PIL's retreat into absence was an act of defiance and opposition to the machinations of the popular music machine that demanded presence. Absence could thus be clearly defined as an oppositional punk gesture. Four-screen, red wall. Despite attempts by the record label to force Pink Floyd into the present light of pop with the next projected Sound of 67 tour, the band's first embrace of presence only emerges on 1977's Animals, which is often presented as their reaction to punk as a result of its comparatively simple structures and socio-political commentary, and the year of its release. Animals, 1977, was largely authored by Roger Waters, who used the project to voice his societal concerns, producing what was considered by NME one of the most extreme, relentless, harrowing, and downright iconoclastic hunks of music to have been made available this side of the sun, and by melody makers Carl Dallas an uncomfortable taste of reality in a medium that has become in recent years increasingly soporific. The album is a critique of the capitalist economic system, in which Waters attempts to illuminate the masses about their exploitation and oppression, with direct comparison to George Orwell's novel Animal Farm, 1945. Waters presents human beings as three different classes of animal. Dogs are represented as the bourgeoisie that aspires to be the ruling pigs, while the sheep are the proletariat, oblivious both to the threat that is posed by the dogs and to their continued exploitation by the pigs. Early performances of the tracks that would eventually appear on Animals, 1977, were even angrier, with 1975's Raving and Drooling, which would become Sheep, finding the band channeling their own earlier piece of psychedelia nostalgia, One of These Days, 1971, but underlined with rushed, tense, and gritty ambience. While Waters' bass pulses, Gilmour offers shards of crashing guitars as Wright's synths seem to be in perpetual detuned descent. Elsewhere, You've Got to Be Crazy of 1975, which would become Dogs, features a vocal delivery at double speed to the version that would eventually be released. Waters' anger with society seemed palpably present. Although the age of these tracks and their already evident lyrical focus challenged the notion of Animals, 1977, being influenced by punk, as indicated, they were performed as early as 1975, it is clear as a band, Pink Floyd was grappling with many of the issues that would be the catalysts in punk's emergence. This is an album that is squarely located in the present, giving way to press reviews that aligned the album directly with the punk explosion. Such observations seemed even more justified in July 1977, at Stade du Parc Olympique, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, when Waters showed the same contempt for the audience that he had displayed in the band's earliest days by spitting at someone who was talking too much. Waters had now seemingly adopted one of the clearest tropes of the punk subculture, spitting. As punk's own progressive tendencies started to find form through an overt reference to rock's past, the key device used was an embrace of the kind of absence that had defined early Pink Floyd, who in return increasingly introduced motifs of presence. As previously noted, in May 1981, PIL appeared at New York's Ritz, playing behind a projection screen of video images, while newer artists such as the Human League employed visuals as a key element of their production, while also playing behind perspex screens. A year earlier in 1980, Pink Floyd had highlighted the fracture between audience and band by performing live while a wall was built between them and the audience. By pointing to the fact that he was struck by the thought that there was a huge wall that you couldn't see between me and the audience, Waters brought his personal awareness of the band's absence to the fore. The performance of The Wall was indeed the culmination of a project that had started with Wish You Were Here, in which Waters attempts to address notions of absent presence and present absence. It was also a project that brought Pink Floyd into a similar creative field as the punk generation's expansion of their radius of creativity. The punk versus prog binary would quickly be shown to be nebulous. Its main thrust was instigated through the codification of punk in the mediation of the subculture through the national music press. However, the simplified symbolism of class allegiance quickly dissolved as punk's popularity grew. On the basis of the key actors of early punk alone, we are able to point to a number of participants with middle-class upbringings, such as Joe Strummer of The Clash, who was the son of a diplomat. Albies, 2003, notes CP. Lee's 2002 suggestion that the majority of punk musicians were middle class, adopting a working class pose for the duration of their involvement in the movement, and his agreement with Home, 1995, that the self-conscious adoption of a class stance by punks was a rejection of a middle class world incarnate. Conversely, although artists associated with progressive rock were typified as being steeped in middle class privilege, Yes vocalist John Anderson, among others, challenged this stereotype through his own working-class background, rejected in favor of post-war middle-class aspiration. The virtuosity associated with middle-class educated progressive rock, in contrast to punk's supposed working-class untutored approach, was also called into question by Pink Floyd's unskilled psychedelic era, in contrast to the highly skilled playing of many of punk's earliest bands such as the Stranglers, the Vibrators, and the Clash. Furthermore, the progressive tendencies displayed in the post-punk era were trailed by Public Image Ltd., a band whose roots were decidedly working class. The links between punk and progressive rock also became increasingly transparent. Punk was presented as a year zero zeitgeist in terms of its cultural presence, yet musically, it looked backwards to a range of styles, many linked to progressive rock, and in turn revealing a hidden symbiosis between the apparently binary oppositional genres. Indeed, the Sex Pistols' first Manchester Lesser Free Trade Hall gig in 1976 saw the band supported by progressive blues rockers Solstice, while numerous Sex Pistols publications note their gig at Didsbury College, Manchester, on October 1, 1976, with progressive folk rock band Gryphon. Although close investigation into this gig has shown that it didn't ultimately take place, it also reveals links between punk and progressive rock that challenge the simple binaries presented by the rock press. The Sex Pistols and Gryphon had met in Manchester and had found a common ground through a joint love of bands such as Henry Cow and Van der Graaf Generator, and as a result both were aware of Peter Hamill's abrasive songs on 1975's Nadir's Big Chance, which was played by members of Van der Graaf Generator in an enthusiastic garage punk-like style. When the Sex Pistols were negotiating a deal with EMI, the label suggested they resurrect Harvest Records for the band. When the band refused, due to links with Pink Floyd, the label was offered to Wire instead. Dave Oberle of Gryphon subsequently provided backing vocals on Wire's debut album Pink Flag. In response, Gryphon members Richard Harvey, as Rick Mansworth, and John Davey as John Thomas formed the band, who had a punk hit in 1977 with Little Girl, originally self-released on Can't Eat Records and eventually Harvest. The shift from progressive rock to punk was also highly visible in the case of The Police, whose individual members rejected the music they had been associated with in order to embrace punk. Drummer Stuart Copeland had been a member of Curved Air, while Sting was in the jazz rock fusion act Last Exit. After self-releasing the debut single Fallout, the duo were invited by gong musician Mike Howlett to join the progressive space rock band Strontium 90, which featured Andy Summers on guitar. The trio would then join forces, sans Howlett, to create new wave act The Police. Although presented as being in diametric opposition to each other through Johnny Rotten's t-shirt, Pink Floyd's relationship with punk was more clearly outlined through these authenticating notions of absence and presence that reveals Pink Floyd's cooperative anarchy as its own punk expression. Pink Floyd's journey took them from a period where their abrasive improvisations were performed at unsuspected pop audiences as an act of absence. Similarly, the first shows by the Sex Pistols saw aggressive, untutored high-speed rock performed at equally unsuspecting discotheque audiences. Both Pink Floyd and the Sex Pistols demanded a response from their audiences and considered violent reactions towards them an affirmation of performative success. In both Pink Floyd and punk rock's formative years, musical ability was less important than the need to achieve a stylistic vision that was in opposition to the dominant mainstream form. Punk rock used physical, communal, pop presence as reaction to the perceived geographical, economic, and performance distance of the progressive rock mainstream. Floyd's own oppositional vision deployed tactics of distance as a punk-like defiance of the radio-friendly presence of popular music of the late 1960s. Punk's growth saw artists such as John Lydon's Peel draw on Toynbee's radius of creativity to embrace the sonic and visual performance tactics of artists associated with progressive rock's left field, as well as the psychedelic rock of early Pink Floyd. In so doing, they made a punk-like statement in opposition to the systematic structures associated with the codification of punk and embraced techniques of absence. Absence was thus presented as a punk statement in opposition to the presence of punk's mainstream. Pink Floyd's development would see them using musicological, visual, and thematic motifs of absence until the release of Animals, 1977, where they engaged in concepts that were located in a social present. The question of distance between presence and absence resulted in the creation of the concept To the Wall, 1979, and saw the band exploring similar aesthetics to the progressive punk bands later defined as post-punk. Both presence and absence thus become a marker of rock authentication. Both are tactics that underline the punk in Floyd and the progressive in punk. That infamous I Hate Pink Floyd t-shirt would become shared among the Sex Pistols, with various members wearing it in the band's early days. Indeed, it would become as much a part of the biographies of the Sex Pistols as it was Pink Floyd's. It marks the moment of generational transition. While rehearsing at their Denmark Street studio in a building that was shared with Pink Floyd album sleeve designers Hypnosis, Johnny Rotten confronted Aubrey Powell in the shared hallway. At once struck by the threat represented by the t-shirt statement, Powell asked why Rotten would wear it. Rotten's response was typically acerbic. "You are old men. You hear Crosby, Stills, and Nash all day. You are finished. We are the new wave. Watch out." He was very aggressive, but I realized that there was a change in the air. The significance of the t-shirt would be recognized in 2017, when the garment was included in Pink Floyd's Victoria and Albert Museum exhibition, Their Mortal Remains. Its inclusion not only emphasized the supposed antagonism that existed between the punks and the dinosaurs they'd come to replace, but, through its placement immediately before the Animals, 1977 exhibit, also succeeded in underlining Pink Floyd's own punk attributes, even if the roots of those attributes actually dated back a full decade earlier, to 1966.